The movie opens to a vast expanse of barren desert. Millionaire Richard and his girlfriend Jennifer, aka Jen, arrive in a helicopter for Richard's annual hunting trip with his friends. Richard has shown up early to spend some quality and sexy time with his girlfriend. As the pilot is about to leave, he sneaks Richard a peyote as a welcoming gift for him to enjoy. In the house, immediately after arriving, the two engage in a fierce sexual battle in bed. Later, as Jen is sleeping, Richard receives a call from his wife and talks about home, like the loving husband he absolutely isn't. Jen is apparently aware of Richard's marital status, but still chooses to continue their secret rendezvous. The next morning, a scantily clad Jen makes her way to the living room, casually bobbing her head to the music she's listening to. Suddenly, she notices two men staring at her from outside. As it turns out, they are Richard's friends, Stan and Dimitri, who have arrived a day earlier than scheduled. Richard is visibly annoyed at the interference as he wants to keep Jen a secret. As Jen is leaving the room, the two men, especially Stan, stare at her lustfully. Later that night, the four have a little party by the pool. Dimitri has a binocular, which he's creepily using to look at Jen's features, while Stan cannot take his eyes off her. Dimitri notices the peyote and inquires about it. Richard says that it's a local hallucinogenic drug that is strong enough to take out an entire football team. Upon his friend's distressing enthusiasm over the dangerous drug, he affirmatively narrates a story about a Polish guy who had sawed off his own leg after the ingestion of the drug and bled to death. He asks Jen to keep the drug in a safe place, away from the two guys. Jen takes the drug to the living room and keeps it in the pendant of her necklace. Then, Jen drunkenly starts a sensual dance, and after Richard refuses to accompany her, she asks Stan to dance with her. He immediately complies, and the two engage in an intoxicated, subtle, erotic dance, which Stan regards as provocative. The next morning, when Jen goes to have breakfast, she notices that Richard is nowhere to be seen. Stan excitedly invites her to join him for breakfast and informs her that Richard has left to give their passports to the gamekeeper, which will take him all morning. He tries to desperately get her attention, but she proceeds to ignore him, focusing on her phone. Finally, she gets uncomfortable by Stan's constant stare and leaves to pack her bags as she has to leave that day. In the room, as she was changing, she notices Stan peering through the door. He apologizes for catching her off guard, but still proceeds to enter the room without her permission and sit on her bed. He slips her his business card, asking her to contact him when she can. She responds by saying she will be too busy with work, which makes the man scoff in sarcasm. She keeps rejecting his advances and ultimately states that he is not her type because of his short stature. Offended by the revelation, Stan tries to force himself on her, firing blames at her for the provocative dance last night. Jen begs him to let her go, but he is relentless. She notices Dimitri standing by the door and silently pleads him to intervene, but that heartless man turns a blind eye, closing the door instead. In the living room, he turns the volume of the TV to the maximum to drown out her screams and nonchalantly goes for a swim. When Richard returns, he notices the tense atmosphere of the house and asks his friends about it. Stan just simply tells him that there's been a slight problem with Jen. Richard finds Jen curled up in their bed, crying silently. She keeps asking Richard to call the helicopter as she wants to go home. Richard suspects what has happened during his absence, but all he does is simply shout at his friends for messing things up. Later, when Jen wakes up, Richard informs her that he has taken care of everything. He further asserts that he has made some phone calls to get her a job in Canada and insists that it is practically Los Angeles, her dream city. Jen refuses to go to Canada and asks him to call the helicopter once again to take her home. Jen's resistance angers Richard, leading to an argument which compels her to snap at him, threatening to reveal everything to his wife. Richard violently smacks her across the face, labeling her as a whore. In response, Jen leaps out of the room and runs barefoot in the desert, with Richard following her. The two friends notice the situation and join him as well. Jen reaches the edge of the cliff. With no place to run to, she abruptly comes to a halt. Richard tries to sweet-talk her out of the situation, but she is adamant about not moving an inch. Ultimately, he gives up and calls the pilot to pick her up. Everything seems to be going well when suddenly, Richard pushes her off the cliff. She violently lands on a sharp branch and gets impaled. Freaking out, the other two ask Richard the reason for taking such a drastic step, to which he states if she were to leave the place alive, they would all go to prison. He plans to continue their hunting trip as if nothing happened, and on the way, they will clean up the mess. While the three murderers return to their place to get their weapons for the hunt, Jen somehow manages to gain an ounce of her consciousness. She desperately tries to reach for her lighter, which has fallen off along with her, to burn the base of the branch. After successfully carrying out her plan, she ultimately tries to drag herself to move to a place to hide. She stands with her back against the bottom of the cliff when she hears the three men approach. The men, baffled at the disappearance of Jen's body, plan to hunt her. They are left with no choice but to climb down the cliff. With no offered explanation as to how Jen has managed to survive after being turned into a literal donut, the movie proceeds to show Jen walking off in search of a place to take refuge by the time the three men arrive. They realize that Jen had been right under their nose, which they didn't notice, but they do come across a trail of Jen's blood and decide to follow it. They reach a lake and Richard suggests splitting up. Dimitri agrees while Stan chickens out and says that he will stay in the car, lest Jen shows up this way. The three carry their respective jobs. Jen, meanwhile, is crossing the lake when she hears Dimitri's approaching quad bike. She slips underwater as his bike passes by. Crawling behind a boulder, she notices the unsupervised gun that Dimitri has left while he's relieving himself. She makes her way to grab it, resolving to exact her revenge on the man who did nothing to stop his friend. As she grabs the gun, Dimitri is immediately alerted. He turns around and raises his hand in surrender. Jen shows no mercy and presses the trigger. Nothing happens. Dimitri immediately throws Jen and ridicules her for being stupid enough to think he would leave a loaded gun unsupervised. He alerts the other two that he has found Jen and will deal with her. He proceeds to torture her by arbitrarily drowning her, treating her like his prey. Fortunately, Jen manages to grab a knife from his pocket and proceeds to stab him in the eye. The pain from the sudden attack makes him let go of Jen as he falls into the water himself. Without an ounce of empathy, Jen stabs him again in the other eye, leading to his death. Jen disposes of his corpse in the water, grabs his weapons, and sets off in his quad bike. Unaware of what has transpired, Stan takes a relieved nap as he believes Dimitri has dealt with Jen. Later in the night, Jen's bike stops working after covering a little distance. Thus, she has no choice but to travel on foot. She searches for a suitable hideout until she's ready to look for the other two. Upon finding one, Jen lights a fire and drinks a can of beer she has found in Dimitri's backpack. She finally starts looking at the branch stuck inside her abdomen. She tries to take it out, but screams in excruciating pain. As she is tearfully contemplating her situation, she takes notice of her necklace. She opens her pendant, revealing the drug Richard had mentioned on the night when everything seemed fine. She remembers the side effects of the drug and decides to use it. Despite the foul taste, she still eats it. She immediately begins to feel the effects of the drug and suffers from hallucinations. Then, she proceeds to tend to her wounds without feeling an inkling of pain. She pulls out the branch, leaving a gaping hole in her abdomen, which she closes by placing the burning hot skin of the beer can. The next morning, Stan wakes up terrified by a smack of blood on the windshield, which turns out to be Richard's prey from his hunt. Both seem to be in a lighter mood, believing that Jen is dead. They both wonder about Dimitri as Stan goes to wash his face by the lake. What he sees makes him puke his guts out. Dimitri's bloated body is floating in the water. Realizing it is Jen's work, Richard and Stan have no choice but to stuff their friend's pockets with rocks and drown him, while simultaneously promising to search for Jen. Before getting into his car, Richard throws a punch at Stan in anger. In the meantime, Jen wakes up and proceeds to go in search of the two friends. As she makes her way out of her hideout, Richard shows up and blows off her head. She wakes up, gasping. What follows is a series of disturbing nightmares that are a result of the hallucinogen. Jen finally gets out of the loop of broken hallucinations and brings herself back to consciousness. She makes her way out to end them, once and for all. We follow Richard and Stan in a pickle regarding their plan to find Jen. Richard suggests splitting up once again to check the entire area and meeting up at the same location they have started from, but Stan refuses. Frustrated, Richard leaves Stan alone to continue his objective. Stan produces a mirror from the trunk of the car to treat his wound, but what he doesn't realize is that the reflection of the mirror gives away his location to Jen, who is surveying the entire area with binoculars. As Stan leaves to search for Jen in a car, she follows him barefoot from a distance. After driving through the desert for a while, he notices his car has run out of fuel. He leaves his car to get the fuel, which Jen uses as an opportunity to use her 8x scope rifle to target him. The heavy rifle is shaky in her injured hands, but after a lot of struggles, she succeeds at pressing the trigger, injuring Stan's shoulder. The man starts to bleed profusely, while Jen falls due to the jarring effect of the rifle. When she gets up, she notices Stan is nowhere to be found. Grabbing the rifle, she moves closer to his car. With her rifle in position, she is trying to locate him. Just then, she discovers the trail of blood and begins to follow it. Stan, with an injured shoulder, is trying to escape as fast as he can. He wraps a cloth around his wound to stop the blood from creating a trail. Jen fails to catch up to him and is left with his discarded shoe instead. As it turns out, Stan has hidden and is planning on shooting her. Jen, unbeknownst to the situation, still tries to find him. While she is unaware of her surroundings, he manages to fire a shot which wounds her ear. For a moment, she hears a strange ringing. It is now her turn to run away again. She is running. She breaks the glass of her flashlight to cripple Stan. The shards have resulted in deep cuts on his foot. He violently sticks his fingers into his wounds and pulls the shards out. Blinded by anger, he runs back to his car and drives it straight at Jen. He doesn't even attempt to swerve when Jen points her rifle at him. Jen shoots him once in the forehead, finally killing him. As she opens the door, Stan's corpse falls off. She enters the car and hears Richard's voice on the radio transmitter. Determined, she drives toward the house. Concurrently, Richard is waiting for Stan at their designated meeting spot. Upon realizing that he is not going to come, he understands what might have happened to him. Thus, he returns to the house and calls for the helicopter. As he's waiting, he goes to take a shower. In the shower, he hears a thud. Still naked, he grabs his gun to check the source of the noise. He frantically scours the entire area but finds nothing. He goes to sit in his living room and mistakenly turns on his television, which scares the hell out of him. As he turns around, he finds Jen pointing a gun directly at him from the outside. He is about to reason with her when she opens fire, injuring his abdomen. This finally begins his annual hunting trip, but this time, he's the prey, and she's the hunter. Richard drags himself through his house to hide as Jen continues to chase him. While Jen is approaching a room, she is unaware that he is waiting to shoot her. Fortunately, she notices the blood from Richard's wound on the floor, alerting her to find a different way. Richard notices he's losing a lot of blood, which prompts him to wrap a cellophane paper around the injury. Moments later, Jen finds him and shoots him again, leading to a frenzied chase between the two. Jen, while running, slips on the huge amount of blood on the floor. The fall allows Richard to attack Jen and torture her. Ultimately, Jen attacks the wound in his stomach, which makes him wail in pain and let go of her. She hurriedly reaches for her rifle and without losing a second, shoots him. In the end, the three men who abused and almost killed Jen meet their deserved fate, while Jen, with her entire body injured and covered in blood, leaves the house content. The movie ends with the sound of the approaching helicopter as Jen turns around.